Okay, everybody, this is the fifth and final video lecture on the chapter of disorders. And this lecture will cover the topic of dissociative disorders and schizophrenia. So dissociative disorders is a fancy word for split personality disorder. And the idea is that we disassociate our personality, that aspects of our consciousnness split apart. So there is a little bit of debate amongst professionals if there is such a thing as a split personality. The idea is that we disassociate so much, our consciousness separates to such a degree that you have like a whole personality over here, right? And you remember personality are your thoughts and patterns that are consistent across time. So that let me back up. Let me offer a couple examples of what we mean by disassociate. This would be, and it's disassociate your consciousness, right? So it's like when you're driving down the road and you realize you've missed your turn, like, well, you don't remember going past your turn, but we call that road hypnosis, right? But it's the idea that you were in such a trance-like state that things happened in your awareness that you didn't pay any attention to because you disassociated from the present moment. Or you have this traumatic accident and you remember coming up to the stoplight and you remember waking up in the hospital, but all of that, what happened to you in between, all of your emotions and your memories and your experiences, they're just gone because you disassociated from your consciousness. And so the idea that you disassociate so completely for such an extended period of time that you take on a new persona, you take on a new personality, right? That's the idea of a split personality. And there's debate if that happened, if you can actually disassociate that much. It's pretty clear that people have these disassociative experiences when they have this break from consciousness, right? And you block out or you don't remember. You remember this and you remember that, but nothing in between. Those would be a dissociative experience, or perhaps what's called a dissociative, and I see some typos, a dissociative amnesia, right? So that would mean for a period of time, you don't remember your name, but maybe later on you do, or you don't remember, parts of you. You don't remember, so amnesia is you forget. Dissociative fugue, I believe is how you say that. If you are Breaking Bad fans and you remember season 1, and that's where, so you remember the story of Walter White and he's making all the blue methamphetamine, right? Well, he's just found out he has cancer and he's out in the desert and he's making his meth and all of these things happen. And he tells his wife that he's had this dissociative fugue, that this stressful event caused him to like wander off and forget who he is. And this really happens. I mean, people really do this. They have these stressful events and then they find them sort of spaced out someplace else. So the sudden wandering away it's usually due to trauma. And even in the model of this multiple personalities, a TV show used to be on Netflix was called United States of Terra. And she had 6 personalities. And the idea, going back to a previous chapter, that when we were talking about consciousness, that the consciousness starts out as this like whole circle. And then when we have traumatic events, part of our consciousness chips away, right? And our wholeness, the wholeness of our consciousness, the wholeness of our being breaks off when bad things happen as a way of protection. So the idea that you have these multiple personalities, they are triggered by traumatic events. In United States of Terra, depending upon whatever the environment called of her, she would shift into one personality. So if her kids were being threatened at school, she would become, I forget the character's name, but basically he was this motorcycle riding guy who wore, t-shirts with no sleeves. If she needed to be Betty Homemaker, she would shift into that personality. We all do this to some extent. We take on different aspects of our personality, but the idea of a dissociative disorder is that aspect of our personality becomes complete and it disassociates from the rest of us, that they're not connected. Okay, so yeah, I hope that kind of makes sense. I'm keep using the same words over and over again, but it's the idea that it's like an extreme version of spacing out. Schizophrenia. So what characterizes schizophrenia are these, what we would call two symptom clusters, right? And these are considered breaks from reality. So people who suffer from schizophrenia will have their first psychotic break. And that's simply a fancy way of saying that for a period of time, they believe things that are not real. That's what it means to break from reality, that they are in an alternate state, that they have completely lost touch with what's really going on, right? With what the way the world really is. The schizophrenic, so there's two clusters. You have what's called positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Let me repeat, these are not good symptoms and bad symptoms, right? Positive symptoms are distortions, are changes in your behavior that are in addition to normal. So they are things that non-schizophrenic people don't have. You have things that everyone else doesn't have. You see things, you hear things, you believe things, but the rest of us don't. Those are called positive symptoms, right? They're additions. You can have false beliefs that we would call delusions, and there's a whole list of different kinds of delusions of grandeur. I remember reading somewhere they said that pretty much in the mental hospital at any given time, there's a couple Jesuses, right? There's people believe that they're God. You can have delusions of persecution. People are after you, like my friend David believed everybody was always after him. Hallucinations, right, are also positive symptoms. You see things, hear things, feel things that everybody else doesn't feel, right, that no one else sees. The most common hallucination are sounds, voices. We hear sounds. A friend of mine has two grown daughters, and both of them have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And I remember her saying to me one time she wasn't really worried about them because their voices in their head were not telling them bad things, right? She heard voices, which is most common. It's most common to hear things, not necessarily to see things, but they weren't telling her to harm. So you would be more concerned, if the voices in your head were telling you. The Son of Sam, I believe, is a story about a serial killer, and he believed, if I remember the story correctly, he believed that the dog next door was telling him was the devil and was telling him to kill people, right? That would be a hallucination. And then his delusion would be that he had to do that, David also believed that when he drove up to a stoplight, he could will the light to change colors, right? And he believed he was a wizard. I remember that one. Remember we were on a road trip together, and he used to have a wizard staff, which is basically just a long stick. And when we got out to go get gas or food or something, we didn't have to lock the car. He didn't worry about it because his staff would protect us, right? Most people don't believe in that. And when the birds, like in the fall, you see all the birds of prey sitting along, the fence posts and the signs, that those birds were there to greet him as he traveled through Kansas, right? Sort of delusions of, I don't know, would they be referenced? Something like that. And then the negative symptoms. Again, these are things things are lacking, right? A person who suffers from negative symptoms, they lack affect. So their voice or their emotional expression is very flat. Most people's voice goes up and down a little bit, right? The pace that you speak, the emotions that you speak, to have a flat affect is just like all the time, and you have no emotional expression at all, just very, very flat. Or what's to say, they can't produce speech, or maybe they move very, very slowly. I think there's a movie, Robin Williams, Awakenings, has an example of some of these folks that are sort of stuck in a psychotic episode, and they're moving, right? But they move so slowly, it's imperceptible. You can't even see it. This is just a fancy slide, not fancy, but this is just a slide that lists some of the other elements of schizophrenic. Again, just like with all the others, it shows up in your 20s, right? If you get through your 20s without having a break, you're good to go. Was to say about 1% of people only have one episode. Apparently they're pretty scary if you are a parent or a loved one. They run in families. There is a little bit of evidence that says, which is difficult to even explain, but there's some evidence that it's related to the age of the father. So like the older the fathers are, the more likely. I don't have any idea why that is. We do know that it's related to dopamine, right? Too little dopamine, what does it say? Role of dopamine, too much dopamine. Blocking dopamine seems to reduce the symptoms. And then the last one, I don't know if it's in your textbook. I use different textbooks over the years to make these slides. Developmental disorders are a group of disorders that show up in childhood, right? So all these other sort of disorders usually show up later on in adulthood, but these are considered disorders that originate in childhood. Autism spectrum, which we were talking about earlier, is ASD is in here. ASD is in the fifth one. This one has autism and Asperger's. Attention deficit. I've been reading something today, actually, where students are at, where the students are making the mistake and considering and labeling attention deficit as a physical condition. It is considered a cognitive, it is considered a psychological disorder. There may be brain structures implicated, but it is not something, it is something in the head and affects the way that we think and the way that we act. And then finally, this little slide, you don't just want to talk about what makes people disorderly, but what makes people healthy, right? And these are all, it should sound a little bit familiar from the chapters, accept who you are, self-acceptance, trust people, be in relationship, find something you can do, find something you can do well, a reason to get up in the morning, and then just keep trying. And those are the things that promote well-being. That, my friends, ends the chapter on psychological disorders. And thank you for listening.